Racism remains deeply normalized in society, expressed through systemic inequalities and cultural prejudice that marginalize communities of color, but it doesn't have to be. From housing and education to environmental and daily interactions, racism shows up in ways that shapes people's opportunities, safety, and sense of belonging. Hispanic communities, especially Mexican immigrants, face layered forms of exclusion that often go unseen in mainstream conversations. Policymakers have a critical role to play in either reinforcing or challenging these systems. The issue we must confront is how racism continues to thrive within institutions and whether we are willing to replace neutrality with anti-racist actions. This video will explore how racism impacts Hispanic communities across different structures, and by embracing anti-racist ideas and actively challenging these systems, we can begin to dismantle the structural that uphold racism. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi makes it clear that simply being not racist isn't enough to stop systems that marginalize communities like Hispanic immigrants. He defines racism not only as a fixed identity, but as a series of choices supporting or opposing policies that lead to inequality. This directly impacts Hispanic communities who often face barriers created by these very policies in housing, education, and immigration. Kendi also challenges policymakers to move beyond symbolic gestures and embrace structural change. His ideas are especially important for everyday people in these communities who may internalize injustice as a personal failure rather than systemic design. Kendi's work gives language and strategy to those seeking change, and it highlights an issue on whether policymakers will continue practices that reinforce racial inequalities or begin to actively create anti-racist policies that center marginalized voices. Helen Merrill's research on Mexican immigration reveals how skin tones divide even with racial or ethnic groups, exposing a complex layer of racism often overlooked. Her study Perception of Discrimination in New Immigrant Destinations shows that darker-skinned Mexican immigrants report higher levels of discrimination, both from outsiders and within Latino communities. This illustrates a critical issue within Hispanic populations, the way colorism shapes self-perception, opportunity, and belonging. It also highlights the role of systemic norms that reward proximity to whiteness. For policymakers, this is a call to develop programs that address internal group inequality, not just broad racial categories. For Hispanic communities, especially in new immigrant destinations, confronting colorism is essential to building unity and resilience. Merrill's work reminds us that racism isn't always external or obvious. It can be internalized, and it can hurt the very communities working towards justice. Ana Rivera's study, Environmental Injustices Among Hispanic in Santa Clara, California, shows how racism operates through environmental policy and disproportionately harming Hispanic communities through heat exposure and poor infrastructure. These neighborhoods, shaped by redlining and underinvestment, are more vulnerable to extreme weather and less equipped with cooling resources. This is a clear example of how systemic racism embeds itself into physical spaces. The Hispanic residents of Santa Clara are not just facing climate issues, they're facing the legacy of environmental racism. Rivera's work challenges policymakers to see the intersection of race and climate vulnerability and to create environmental policies that prioritize equity. For affected communities, it offers evidence that their struggles are not random, but rooted in structural neglect. Addressing environmental injustice requires not only technical solutions, but also a shift in values, centering the needs of those most historically excluded. For many Hispanic families, racism isn't just a set of offensive remarks or isolated acts. It's the reason their neighborhoods have fewer resources, their schools are underfunded, and their health outcomes are worse. The normalization of systemic inequality makes it harder to see racism as something fixable. Yet, Hispanic communities are not passive victims. They are often leading great efforts to advocate for better policies and visibility. Their lived experiences offer powerful insight into how systemic racism works on the ground. Across institutions, But without institutional support or responsive policymakers, these efforts can only go so far. The issue is between the communities demanding justice and the systems slow to respond, or resistance altogether. Acknowledging this disconnect is the first step toward meaningful change. Policymakers must begin to truly listen to the voices of those most impacted by their decisions. Hispanic communities are doing the work, organizing, educating, and pushing back against policies that harm them. But true progress requires shared responsibility. Policymakers have the resources, influence, and legislative power to turn anti-racist theory into reality. Yet many continue to treat racial inequality as an unfortunate byproduct rather than an urgent priority. This gap between community urgency and institutional passivity reveals a deep problem. The perception among many Hispanics is that political systems are unresponsive unless pressure is sustained. This creates a cycle where trust as government erodes, and the communities are left to protect themselves without support. Breaking this cycle means shifting from symbolic diversity statements to policy reform, from reactive crisis management to proactive equity planning. Change will not happen if responsibility continues to be placed only on the shoulders of people at risk. One of Kendi's most powerful arguments is that racism and anti-racism are not static identities, they are daily choices. This resonates with many Hispanic individuals navigating system designs without them in mind. Whether it's applying for jobs, sending children to school, or seeking medical care, they are often forced to confront bias while also proving their worth. Anti-racism for these people means more than speculation. It means survival. It's the decisions to speak up, to support one another, and to demand better. On the policy side, anti-racism must also be practiced, not just a workshop or a committee. It means passing equitable laws, funding underserved areas, and revising systems that sustain inequality. Both individuals and the institutions must understand that choosing anti-racism is a commitment, not a label, and that commitment has to be renewed with action every single day. The emotional and mental health toll of racism is often underestimated. For Mexican immigrants and other Hispanic groups, persistent exclusion leads to stress, anxiety, and exhaustion. These aren't just side effects, they're consequences of a system that demands resilience without offering relief. The constant need to navigate racism, whether through colorism, policy, or environmental neglect, creates lasting harm. Policymakers rarely account for these impacts, focusing instead on surface-level fixes. But anti-racism must be integrative. It must recognize not only the visible harms of injustice, but the quiet suffering it causes. The people in these communities aren't just asking for equality, they're asking for healing. That healing starts when their realities are acknowledged and when policies are shaped by compassion as well as data. Recognizing the human cost of racism is essential for ending it. One of the most transformative shifts policymakers can make is to treat listening as a political act. Too often, policies are created without input from the communities they most affect. Hispanic communities have long expressed that they need equitable education, safe housing, environmental protection, and dignity. But when their words fall on unlistened ears, the cycle of exclusion continues. Listening means more than gathering feedback. It means incorporating lived experiences into decision-making. For Hispanic stakeholders, being heard is the first step toward being valued. For institutions, it is a test of their commitment to equity. The issue here is sharp. Are policymakers willing to give up control and share power with people most impacted? Real anti-racist policy comes not from speaking over, but from standing with. Racism is not just a past wrong, it is a present structure. As Kendi, Merrow, and Rivera show, it affects how people live, how they're treated, and how their environments are shaped. Hispanic communities face this reality every day. from color-based discrimination to environmental neglect. But their efforts to fight back also point the way forward. Anti-racism is not abstract, it's specific, actionable, and urgent. Policymakers must choose: maintain the status quo or become true partners in justice. The problem is clear. The time for neutrality is over. Every person and institution must decide which side of the line they stand on. By centering marginalized voices, dismantling unjust systems, and committing to real change, we can build a future that does not merely tolerate diversity, but protects and uplifts it.